role of the RCIC is in this, really. And you've talked about this a little bit, but just give us kind of a summary, because it seems like you're in the middle of everybody, really, when you're doing this kind of work.
Yes, yeah. So definitely. So for the employer side, of course, we need to make sure that the employer really is even though there's no longer LMIA, we still need to make sure that that employer is really a genuine employer who's offering a genuine job as well, right? So part of it is the job offer should be at least 30 hours of work per week. And of course, we have to look at the employer's financial ability as well. Even though, again, there's no longer LMIA, for me, I would still use the guideline on how an employer gets approved to be deemed to be a genuine employer. So in terms of the financial ability, I still use the LICO, or the low income. Help me count on this one. What's the CNO?
The cutoff.
There you go. Sorry, you go. And so we need to make sure that they meet the LICO on that one. And of course, if we're matching an employer to a nanny, then we have to make sure that, of course, there are children to be looked after, right? Because that's an easy thing. Like, okay, you're hiring a nanny, but you don't have children, so why are you hiring a nanny, right? So, or if you're hiring a caregiver, who is the caregiver going to be looking after? So, elderly, right? So, when it comes to the elderly, then it has to be senior or someone who has a disability that needs help. And when it comes to that one, then we look at, okay, is there a medical certificate that would prove that your parents or your dad or your mom needs help? There's a disability that needs a live-in caregiver, right? So also with that one, when the employer is hiring a caregiver, the employer cannot just say, I want to hire a live-in caregiver. So that one needs to be justified. Why does your mom or your dad needs a live-in caregiver? So that one needs to be justified medically. So yeah, so that's for the employer side. Now, when it comes to the caregiver side, of course, my role is, of course, to make sure that that caregiver meets the minimum requirement. So one of which would be able to do the job. So if the job is for a caregiver for the elderly, what does the applicant have in terms of the experience? If the applicant has nanny experience and going into a caregiver work, then that would be a refusal for sure, because that person is not able to do the job. So unfortunately, we have to choose another one, right? So a nanny should be matched with an employer that will be that's needing a nanny because the employer has children. And then the next one would be if it's a caregiver, then the employer needs to have an elderly that needs to be looked after. And then the other requirement for a caregiver is that IELTS exam, because now the caregiver is applying for both open work permit and permanent residency. The IELTS needs to be the caregiver needs to meet the IELTS, or not the IELTS, but the language ability. I only use IELTS because it's the common form of exam that our clients use, but essentially it's the language ability, right? So for immigration purposes, for that permanent residency application, the applicant, the caregiver, needs to have a CLB 5.0. And then the other requirement that is also for the permanent residency is the 1 year, the education, wherein the caregiver needs to have 1 year of post-secondary course. So the tricky part of this one, especially if the caregiver is coming from a country wherein their elementary high school doesn't go up to grade 12. let's say for the Philippines. I mean, like now they do have K1 to 12, but before though, maybe like a year ago, they just started a year ago, implemented this new curriculum. But before that, we don't have K1 to 12, even though we have kinder 1 and 2, and then we have elementary from grade 1 to 7, and then high school first year, second year, third year, fourth year. If you sum that one up, it would be 12 years or 13 years, or even more than 12 years. But the immigration officer doesn't see it that way, or they won't see it that way. What would happen is when the education gets evaluated, since that applicant only didn't have K1 to 12, let's say, okay, I'll give you a better example. Okay, so you have an applicant, and the applicant's from the Philippines, didn't have the education from K1 to 12, it was still the old curriculum, but that caregiver has a 2 years of post-secondary course. What will happen is that first year of post-secondary course would be converted into grade 11. The second year would now be translated to grade 12. So meaning to say now, that caregiver is still missing 1 year of post-secondary, even though in her mind, she already has 2 years of college. But really, when we translate it to the Canadian education system, you're still missing 1 year of a post-secondary course. And yeah, and then just, of course, making sure that all of the forms are completely filled out and before we submit to the officer.
Perfect, Israel. So we'll go through those one by one.
Yep.
You answered one of the common issues that you brought up to me before, and I've got all of that included in the slides here. But it's interesting to see this because, I mean, you'd never really think that it's difficult to confirm whether or not someone completed grade 12 when you're thinking of these more advanced requirements of immigration, of caregivers as well. It is such a specialized work, but it's always good to have this kind of perspective because I guess you see this in real life, right, Israel?
Correct. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So incredible. It's an area that I don't think people would have. Or I bet you when you began working in this area, you wish someone told you about this. It's what I was trying to say, because it's something that there's always issues that come up and you never know. You never thought this would be an issue. And then this is one that comes up. So what we're going to do now is I've got a little question for all of you who are either watching the video or the people who are joining us here. And you can answer this in the little chat box over here, just so that Israel and I can go get like a glass of water and continue the lesson. So we'll take a look at this in 37 little seconds, and we'll come back. All right, so I'll give you a little bit of extra time here, so just 45 little seconds. Great, we have a couple responses coming in. All right, so I'll begin here, and then of course we'll get Israel's input with this. So for number one, it can be, of course, difficult to work for both an employer and an employee in terms of matching people with jobs. In my opinion, and I'd love to get some input from Israel, is I think one of the issues that could come up with this is not knowing who the boss is, right? So if the employee is asking for something that doesn't coincide with what the employer is asking, who do you follow, right? So who's in charge of this? Who do you make out the contracts to? All that type of thing. So that's something I think that would be interesting and potentially difficult about working for both an employer and an employee. So let's see if Israel's back. And what's your opinion of that? Is that an issue that can come up, or is it all about pre-screening your clients, having a great relationship?
Yeah, so definitely it would be the pre-screening for sure. So the way we do things is that before the employer hires the employee, the caregiver, the employer would definitely do an interview. So it could be a Skype interview, and then from there they'll be able to also kind of like talk about what the roles and expectations are, and then when it comes to the actual contract, the job contract, really it would be as long as the employer meets the minimum labor standards, then we are all covered, kind of thing, right? So but yeah, so in the interview process it will be shared in there for sure what the roles and responsibility is, and then if the employee has some questions on that one, I'm hoping that the employee would be able to kind of like ask that question to the employer as well, right on that interview as well. So
and I guess that's one of the that must be one of the really good parts about being in a position where you have a whole I don't know how you organize your clients, maybe like in a big Excel file or something like that. But if an employer does not kind of work with a certain employee, you can kind of mix and match other people, right?
That's correct. So yeah, so the employer comes in and the employer says, okay, hey, I need my mom is getting discharged. She has dementia. She needs a female caregiver, unfortunately, because in the hospital she was very, very, very rude to, lack of better terms, to male nurses, or so it doesn't go well with her because of maybe there's some history before, like abuse before. So that's why, okay, my mom only wants female caregiver, and I would rather have someone that has like a bit of knowledge when it comes to dealing with dementia, right? So with those things, then I can go ahead and go to my pool of caregivers and say, okay, I have 5 resumes here for you that kind of like meets your initial criteria. And then the employer reviews a resume, and then now they kind of, okay, let's go set up a Skype interview, and there you go. And then
Yeah, fantastic. Great. There's a comment for number one here that it might be an issue if the client does not give all of the information about themselves at the beginning.
Yes, and that is definitely. I mean, like, I'm pretty sure you have experiences on this one, Kyle. So I mean, like, it's not just the caregiving nursing niche. It's kind of like I think it's in every. There'll be one or two out there that's really hiding something from you, and they don't want to put that one in the application, and then you'll just kind of like see it later on when it's too late. So on that one, my practice is just making sure that every time I meet with my client and that pertains to the actual application, I send an email to that client saying this is what we have discussed, and these are the things that you have told me when it comes to your situation. And at least in that way, and then at the end of the email, it's like, is there anything that I have missed or that we need to address as well, right? At least in that way, you are very transparent to your client that, hey, these are all things that you've told me. So when your application gets refused for misrepresentation, that is unfortunately on you. Okay, so that's how I do my practice on that one. So yeah.
And that must be a difficult position for you as kind of the middleman between everybody, right? Is because you might have an employer that's pretty disappointed in that case.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll give you a very not very sad but unfortunate story, and it's not a caregiver, but it's a one of my clients were in study permit, right? So applied for a study permit, and so everything's good. In turns, she meets all the minimum requirements and even above that one. And I got the refusal letter, not refusal letter, but the opportunity to answer because there is a question. The officer has a question wherein the officer found out that the applicant applied for a federal skilled express entry 10 years ago, but got refused. So that one is even though it was a kind of like an honest mistake or honest, my client didn't realize that she needed to put that one in, even though, because she thought that, hey, it's been 10 years, so I don't think I need to put it. So, but then, of course, the immigration found that one out, and so yeah, so that's unfortunately, because of that one, the application got refused. So yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad. I mean, that's why RCICs and hiring experts comes in, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's it. So for the second one, for negative outcomes of a mismatch, so there's a comment here that that focuses on the employer actually, and it's pretty interesting because maybe the caregiver will show up and start working, but then maybe actually the employer is the one who isn't respecting the contract. And what does this actually happen? What would happen in terms of the actions that you would take or the caregiver would take in this situation?
So yeah, so definitely, yeah, this unfortunately these things happen as well. And that's why the government also changed the program wherein they don't advertise it as a live-in caregiver anymore, like automatically a live-in caregiver, because they feel that the caregivers are being abused in terms of the hours work. I mean, like, because if it's a live-in caregiver, then obviously the caregiver sleeps in the employer's home. So in the middle of the night, the employer wakes the caregiver, but doesn't really compensate the caregiver. So that's why the government changed this one. But when it comes to this one, my advice to the employee would be to respectfully talk to the employer that, hey, I know our contract says this, but then now I see that we need to change it. Is this something that moving forward will be changing? It will be the working hours for me, and I just want to know so that I can kind of like plan my days, right? And if that continues to happen, though, the employee would have resources in terms of the labor standards. For here, the BC labor, wherein the employee can file a complaint, and they are governed. The employer is governed by the BC labor. They need to follow the BC labor standards. So, and that's why also this is one of the big changes. Well, we're in the work permit. The work permit applied by the caregiver is now an open work permit, occupation restricted only, and not employer. For this type of unfortunate event wherein the employee is not able to really continue her working relationship with the employer and have to really go to find a new employer. Finding a new employer, that caregiver, she doesn't need to apply for another work permit and wait for that work permit before she can go to the new employer and prevent the gaps of employment. So she can go ahead and kind of like submit her resignation due to like our working relationship is not working, unfortunately. I'm sending you my resignation, and then a day after the last day, that caregiver can be working for another employer as long as it's the same occupation. So if the occupation is under the home support, they should be under home support only. If it's under the child care, then it would be for child care only.
Yeah, fantastic. You brought up an interesting point. So when they eliminated kind of the wording, I guess, of live-in caregiver, I thought, as someone not kind of in that world, I thought it was because caregivers didn't want to live in the homes of the places where they're working. But is this the case? Do people actually still live in the homes? Is it common?
It is still common, but you can't. It won't be a default, right? You need to get a special. You need to prove that you really need a live-in caregiver based on the medical conditions of the person that you're looking after, you're caring for, right? So if it's an able, like a mobile senior person, I doubt that it will be approved for a live-in caregiver, because you don't need a live-in caregiver on those situations. It's really on situations wherein you have a client that's really end stage dementia, or in the middle of the night, the caregiver, the employer would get up and get confused and sometimes open the gas stove and just leave it, or walk out of the house in the middle of the night. So those types of things, those types of situations wherein you will really need a live-in caregiver to be there as the lifeline. So on those instances, yes, but again, it has to be medically supported.
Yeah, that's incredible. Especially, it shows you kind of the dedication that those caregivers have. I would guess it's really special types of people who want to live in and do that kind of work. How is that reflected in the contract, where if a person has to get up in the middle of the night to help the client go to the washroom or something like that, is that type of thing reflected in the contract itself?
Correct. Yeah. So in some of the contracts, I mean, like your working hours will be, let's say, in the morning, your 8 hours in the morning, and then during the night you're on call. So some employers would pay the caregiver an on-call rate, let's say $1 every hour or $2 an hour, and then once the caregiver is called, then it would be an overtime rate. So it could be an increment of half an hour or minimum of half an hour, I think. So even though you just help your employer for like 15 minutes to go to the toilet, it would be a minimum of 30 minutes kind of thing, right? So it's reflected in the contract, and it would be an overtime rate.
Okay, there's a fantastic question that came in as
Mhm.
well. It says, what does the employer do if the caregiver leaves the job upon arrival? Does the employer have to wait for, it says another 1.5 years, but I'm not too sure where that number would come from.
Yes, and that's the disadvantage of this new program as well when it comes to the employer side, right? What we can, because even though there's a contract, the caregiver can still leave as soon as, I mean, like anytime really, and give a resignation letter and go to another employer. So it doesn't really help the employer after waiting for how many months, and then a day later, as soon as you arrive, a day later you leave, right? So it doesn't really help the employer. So it's really what my practice on this one is, when they create the job contract, I do highlight in there that the contract, let's say it's for 2 years, and I emphasize that one, even though they can resign one day after arriving, right? I'm just trying to kind of like emphasize that one and make it clear to them that the employer wants you to be there. The employer is hiring you to be there, to be with them for 2 years. So I'm hoping you'll, as a human being, as a caregiver, as a nurse, you'll see that one and respect that one, right? That you won't just leave a day after, right? So yeah, but it happens though, and it's unfortunate for sure.
Oh, that would be
And in those,
heartbreaking.
yeah, yeah, and in those cases, I mean, like what I tell my employers that, and I'm transparent with my employers as well. It's like if that happens, we'll go ahead and we'll replace your caregiver. We'll do our very best to kind of like hoping that there's some caregivers locally that can kind of like patch things up while we find a new caregiver for you. So yeah.
Is there ever any kind of headhunting where maybe there's a particular caregiver who's amazing, and then a different family wants that person, so they offer a little bit more money or something like that?
Oh yeah, yeah, that happens. But the actual headhunting, but then I haven't experienced a caregiver going to jump from one employer to another because of that one, right? So, and fortunately, on my practice, they haven't, because yeah. So
What's the average time that a caregiver works for an employer?
when you say average time, like jury, the term, the full term,
Yeah, I mean, it
or
would ideally it would be the 2 years or whatever the contract
oh yeah,
states, but in reality, I'm sure that things happen, and
yeah.
maybe somebody who needed help doesn't need help anymore, or maybe there's a kind of a mismatch, or someone, maybe the caregiver leaves to go back home or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So is it always, do people usually fulfill their contracts?
Yes, yes. Usually they do, especially if they have a target as well, right? A target of really, I need to finish 2 years, right, in order to get my permanent residency status finalized. So they tend to they tend to really stay for that 2 years mark. So yeah, and then also I tend to connect with them still. And if they have any challenges with the employer and now they're thinking of quitting, I kind of like coach them, mentor them on how to deal with those things so that they can still have that good working relationship. Because again, it's on paper, on interview might be, hey, this is a perfect match, but just imagine a stranger living in your house for 2 years. So it's yeah, it's a challenging for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And I think you've answered number three with your comments here, where you're still in touch with your caregivers for I would suppose for years after, um, uh, making sure that everything's okay and coaching them in the various situations that they have.
Correct. Yes. Yes. Because I mean, like, you never know. You'll later on they might be once they have maybe the employer unfortunately passes away, right? So now you have a caregiver that's already here, that you can also find an employer for, or an employer is looking for a caregiver. Hey, there you go. Lucky you, we have a caregiver ready, and who is already here in Canada. So there you go.
That's amazing. Yeah, it sounds like it's easy. Like you say, oh yeah, you're a matchmaking service like that. But I can't imagine the work that goes on behind the scenes to really make sure everyone's happy and reaching their goals.
Right. Yes.
Oh, and I would suppose you'd be in touch with your caregivers anyways, because after the 2 years, they probably want you to do their PR work anyways, right?
That's correct. So yeah, so with this new program, then yes, definitely for sure, because at that 2 year mark, we'll have to submit the final documentation so that their permanent residency application status is finalized. So it's simply with the old program wherein they have a goal of hitting that 2 years of employment as well. And after hitting that employment, they come to me and hey, I'll be finishing my 2 year mark in next month. Can we go ahead and start our PR process? So yeah.
Perfect. And then you have kind of the other branches, I guess, that come up, right? Where somebody wants to, maybe one of your caregivers wants to sponsor a spouse or something, or parents or citizenship. So does it work like that? Is it kind of all encompassing? You go step by step and you get the same caregiver for 5 processes?
That is, yes, that is very, very true. So that's why it's kind of like it's good to have that good working relationship with your client, because again, it's not just a one-time thing. It will be a forever thing. There's a lot of things that they'll be needing help with later on. Their children, their spouse, their parents, and then friends. And yeah, so, and sometimes they come to me and say, hey, I'm now a PR permanent resident. I have registered with the BC Care Age Registry. How do I get hired in the hospital? So that's the other thing.
Yes, now you do. Now you work on that too. Perfect. Do most of the caregivers, do they continue to work as caregivers after they obtain PR and years after that?
Yes, yes. So that is that is the common end goal, whether they like it or not. I mean, like in terms, the only reason why I say that, because some of the caregivers are nurses, right? Nurses in their home country. As soon as they come here as a caregiver and then get their permanent residency and all of those things, and now ready to apply for nursing licensure and nursing license, they're no longer able to, because there's a gap now. So in order for them to get licensed, then they need to kind of like study the entire nursing again. So yeah, so unfortunately, yes, that would be their end goal, is a home support worker in a long-term care facility or healthcare aide in a hospital.
Okay, amazing. So, and that's an interesting angle too, that people are nurses who join caregiving, I guess, because it's a bit more straightforward in terms of obtaining, getting jobs a little bit faster, obtaining PR.